my mind, this is one of your best films. It's epic. The research, the depth, I think, of your reporting, the gathering of archival footage, the interview subjects who you brought to bear here, who are, you know, their testimony is pretty powerful. Can you give the audience some sense of your process in doing a film as, I think, as complex as this? Starting with how you tackled it in the first place, and then trying to keep it together through what was the time of it? Was it 2-year production? But just throughout all of that, there's got to be highs and lows in this.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, I did a film with Bill Moyers in 1995 in Oklahoma City for NBC called Oklahoma City 1 year later. So I was there 6 months after the bombing.
Mark, can you talk closer to the mic?
Mike.
Testing?
No.
Testing? Is that working? So I had done a film called Oklahoma City 1 year later for NBC with Bill Moyers. And I met some of the people that you met tonight. I met Kathy and her husband who passed away. I met Bud Welch, who lost his daughter and ultimately befriended McVeigh's father. I met Marcia Kite, who led the whole victim right movement that got federal law changed. And the focus of that film was on the victims. So that was the starting point, was to reconnect with them. We had stayed in touch with them over the years, but to meet with them, to get their input, to see how this horrible tragedy had this profound effect on their lives, as Katie Couric says, and they became missionaries, each of them in a different way, on a lifelong odyssey. So we began there, and then I think the challenge for me, and it was very difficult, I would admit, was you have a crime story which, a horrible mass murder crime story, terrorism story, and so that was what HBO and, you know, kind of the forces of television, and I've worked with HBO for 30 years, and they're great, but that was, the push was, let's stick with the crime story. But we felt from the very beginning that the victims, we had made this film about the victims, stayed in touch for over 20 years, and that their journeys were absolutely essential and couldn't be ignored. So how to integrate those two, that was the first challenge. And then the second challenge was there were legitimate questions about what happened. No question about McVeigh, obviously, Nichols and Fortier, but some of the questions that you heard raised here, and Kathy had obviously gone on this odyssey to try to find out and become almost a citizen investigator. But even the FBI special agent and obviously the journalists, Mike Betcher and Bob Sands, his investigator, they all felt there was more to the story, but that for some legitimate reasons, the federal government didn't want to make the mistake that had been made in the sedition trial in Fort Smith, which, you know, most people are not aware of. And the final twist to that was, of course, that the Murrow building had been targeted in 1983, and that fact, although there was an article in the New York Times back in the 90s, it just, I don't remember knowing about it. And most of the survivors and family members didn't know about it. So that, of course, can lead one down, as we were having dinner tonight with Oliver Stone, and the word conspiracy came up, and it was kind of wild when he said, you know, don't even mention that word. I hate that word. Yeah. But obviously, the executives we work closely with and who we respect tremendously, they also were wary of the falling down the so-called black hole, the conspiracy black hole. So it was braiding and weaving together those three elements. The story of what happened, which the inciting incident for making the film was in discussions we were having with HBO about the rise of just violent extremism. And obviously in the wake of January 6th, what's really going on? And one of the executives said, didn't you make that film about the Oklahoma City bombing? I said, yeah. And she said, I was having dinner with my two kids and they go to like Ivy League schools and somehow it came up and they were like, what's the Oklahoma City bombing? And we were like, what? And she said, yeah, I don't think a younger generation knows much. Obviously 9/11 kind of eclipsed everything. And she said, I don't think many younger people even know this story. So we found that hard to believe, but we went back to our shop and asked some of our younger colleagues, and sure enough, was that the guy that was sending letter bombs? And, no, wasn't that it? Yeah, right. That was the starting point, was, okay, you just have to tell the crime story, the story. And then there, you want to weave in this human story of forgiveness, which I feel was absolutely essential, but it wasn't necessarily in their mind. And then the alternative theories or questions that are still legitimate, you got to be careful. And HBO had been burnt on the 20th anniversary of 9/11. Spike Lee did a very moving, incredible special. But there was a whole section about building 6 or 4, I forget which one, but that was controversial, and they ultimately had to cut it out. It went on the air, and then they had to pull it off and cut it out. So I understood there was trepidation, when you're getting into the Aryan Republican Army, the bank robbers. Even Carol Howe, now, which is on the record, that she was an ATF undercover agent, that she was warning them something was going on. So how do you weave those three together, tell the story to a new generation, add the human element from the victim's perspective, especially, Kathy and Bud, this idea that one could find grace and forgiveness, which I'm not saying I could ever do, but they were capable of it in some amazing way. And at the same time, let people know that, look, all the questions might not be answered, that there are legitimate questions, and that this wasn't whatever one feels about these alternative theories. I think the history we lay out, you see that this idea of leaderless resistance, this idea of a second American Revolution, this idea of Christian identity, this is very much alive. And that McVeigh was totally influenced, including his experience, of course, in the military itself and in the Gulf War. These shaped him. So he didn't just come out of nowhere as kind of a crackpot. So it was hard to find the balance, to weave those elements into a coherent whole that felt organic, that felt authentic, that you don't get confused. There was lots of discussion about Kathy, who I obviously, feel is an incredible woman, but there were just questions. She's not a PhD, she's not a detective, she's kind of a self-appointed. You're right, that it was not easy, and the echoes of today, the final thing, what we call the third wave, which we're all living through, there was some resistance to that also in do we really need to go there? You know, isn't it enough to just end it? I mean, Bill Clinton's line, I will say, when Bill Clinton said that, it's like McVeigh won. I was sitting like this, I was speechless. It just stopped me. I couldn't believe I had heard him say that. His mics are allergic. Oh, there you go.
So let's talk about Bill Clinton for a second.
Yep.
Getting Bill Clinton on the record, what's that like?
That's where Katie Kirk was tremendously helpful.
Go.
Because she knew him and she was able to help us do that. But I think the thing that clinched it was, I read Bill Clinton's autobiography, and there's barely any mention of this whole so-called patriot movement in Arkansas during his governorship. And I think, and he wanted to talk about that. He had never talked about it in all these interviews, and given what was happening, he saw this parallel also, as he says, you know, these ideas that were so extreme then and so horrific are all of a sudden mainstream. He wanted to, and it was personal to him. He knew that cop, the African-American cop that was shot. So I think he really wanted to go on the record about, hey, you know, as he says even, and this was a shocker to me, I wasn't aware, that literally when he got the report in the Oval Office, and I remember first hearing about the Oklahoma City bombing because I was at the Discovery production office in Maryland, just beginning a project on the CIA, and I, like most people, felt Islamic terrorism. The World Trade Center had been bombed 2 years earlier by a truck bomb. It seemed to make perfect sense. But the idea that Clinton, right from the get-go, suspected that it was homegrown because of his own experience with these extremist groups in Arkansas. So I think he wanted to talk about that.
Comes and goes. Two things. One, and then we'll go to the audience. One, are you satisfied with the ultimate product here of this film? Something that you were talking about, weaving together all these elements. What we saw on the screen, are you satisfied with how it finished? And secondly, what are your own personal thoughts about these loose ends? You're the journalist here. You know, you're the filmmaker. It's not something that you really need to speak on. But I know you have thoughts about whether a woman like Kathy would have taken this farther. There would have been further discovery. There might have been further revelation. So I'm curious where you sit now on that.
Well, I feel, you know, with some distance that we found the right balance, which is certainly gratifying. My own personal feelings, well, two things. First of all, personally, I give tremendous credit to my producing partner, you know, Daphne Pinkerson, and others that probably tempered some of my leaning more in one direction or another, and trying to make it as even-handed as possible in showing many perspectives. So I'm glad that you know, I had people arguing against me at certain points for not being just on one side. As far as my own personal feeling, it's funny that we were just having dinner with Oliver because it would be an interesting discussion. My bottom line is that, as I said moments ago, I think McVeigh was a product, the Turner Diaries, which you know is out there right now as we talk. He came out of this movement which we're dealing with right now. In terms of what might have happened, I think the lesson of history, at least my sense of it, is that Carol Howe was down there as an ATF informant. There were probably other informants. Roger Moore has a very shady past of dealing weapons in both Vietnam and in Central America during, you know, so kind of shady liaisons with the intelligence and military community. So this idea that you got to cover up, you know, if it ever came out that, hey, the U.S. government had been warned and had not taken the warnings, or let's say they had warned and they did have a bomb squad there to look at 6 in the morning or 7 in the morning, didn't see anything, left, or somehow got confused or double-crossed, or they would have been subject to civil suits and credibility questions. Look just what happened with this failure by the Secret Service, So you can imagine. So the instinct is to, let's not go there. Yeah. Let's not look at it. So my sense is they may have had some sense that, as the guy that was the head of the ATF admits right on camera, 2 years after Waco, let's be on the alert. But it probably doesn't make sense to scare families and warn them that, this might not be a good day to have your kids go to the daycare center, or let's not panic, as he says, but we have reports that something's going to happen. There's something in the air. We have people talking about plots that are happening. And whether out of luck, whether out of incompetence, confusion, mixed signals, because that's a whole other thing that happens. It happened in 9/11. It's a similar story. The CIA knew these bombers were in the United States. They did not share the intelligence with the FBI because the CIA wants to penetrate Al-Qaeda. Understandable. They don't want to just bust these guys and ruin their opportunity to get deeper and deeper. Same here. The FBI may have had people in this extreme right. The ATF has. The FBI and the ATF are at each other because Waco was an ATF disaster that the FBI had to come in. Ruby Ridge was an ATF disaster that so all of these things could be elements. But again, bottom line is, for the meta picture, is that Timothy McVeigh was not a lone assassin or bomber, that he was part of a movement. That's a fact. How much the government knew about that and had penetrated that.
We may never know that.
We may never know, or even instigated, as a government confidential informant can, to get evidence. It's like, hey, why don't we do it? Oh, let's bomb someplace. Yeah. So I don't know. I will share this with the audience here. I spoke to Andreas Strassmeyer. I had over a 90-minute conversation with him. He, of course, denies, he lives outside Berlin. He, of course, denies any involvement or knowledge. But the more I spoke to him, because not only does he deny that, he denies he's a racist. He denies he's an anti-Semite. He claims that he lived in Israel for a few years. He claims he's a Zionist. He claims his best friend is an ex-Black Panther. I mean, the guy, the more I talked to him, the more I was convinced that this guy was somehow maybe working for German intelligence, maybe with connections to U.S. intelligence, even though the prosecutor says she might not have seen. His father was Helmut Kohl's right hand. He comes from a family that was very plugged in. He was in the German military in intelligence. So that, despite all his denials, the more he talked and just told me these stories, the more I was convinced, no, this is not some normal, this guy's got something. And I also spoke lengthy conversations with one of the Aryan Republican Army, this group of bank robbers that you saw. Now, this guy's story is even more incredible, and you can see the concern of going down the rabbit hole, because Peter Langham was his name, known as El Comandante Pedro. Comandante Pedro. He's the guy in the mask there, pouring the money out. You're not going to believe this. He was eventually busted by the feds in a shootout where they pretty much tried to kill him, and amazingly he survived. Anyway, in a federal prison, he is the first federal inmate to have a sex change operation. I'm telling you, it just gets crazier and crazier. And all during this period that you saw him with the Aryan Republican Army, he was leading a secret life as a transvestite, going to Kansas City and having a dating life. So, and then in talking with him, it's his feeling that two of the members of the Aryan Republican Army were involved with McVeigh and were involved in the bombing. So you can get lost in that world very easily. As you can see, it just gets crazier and crazier. You don't know at some point what's real, what's not real. I think we found a pretty good balance. But it's going to be interesting to see because this spring, first, we need to make it through this election cycle and hopefully, you know, a new administration. But this spring will be the 25th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing. So you're going to see a lot of CNN, Discovery, National Geographic. They're all doing specials and series on the Oklahoma City bombing. You know, 30th. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Anybody have questions for Mark? Yeah, I thought so. Okay. Who? Yeah. Sorry, Alex. I didn't mean to.
Thank you. Back to Terry Nichols. I can understand why HBO and you would want to pursue it for the film. But what I cannot understand is why, assuming Nichols is still alive and sentient, why has no public interest group, no journalist, Bill Clinton, for Pete's sake, why have they not gone back to Nichols? That boggles the mind.
Good question. I have, you know, corresponded with Terry Nichols. We were very close to getting the Justice Department. Now remember, the Attorney General was involved in this case. So it's a touchy subject. And still, we were able to get the Justice Department, the Bureau of Prisons, the FBI, all to agree, if Terry Nichols agreed, that we could interview. So that was a breakthrough, but it was unfortunately twice kiboshed by the warden of Florence, which is the Supermax prison in Colorado, and his rationale, which I understand to a certain extent, was if I let him go on camera, I'm going to have to let the shoe bomber, I'm going to have to let, actually Ramzi Youssef, there's a thing like Bombers Row. Ramzi Youssef, who was the mastermind of the first World Trade Center bomber, he's there, as was the Unabomber. These three were all in a similar place in Florence. And he said that I don't want to deal with that. You're able to write letters to him. He's able to write to you, but he kiboshed it. I'm interested to see if anyone else can get to him. You know, now that the anniversary is coming up in the spring, it was high on our list. We thought we were going to be able to pull it off, but unfortunately, as I say, twice it was kiboshed by the warden.
Anybody else have a question for Mark?
I'm just curious, since the film's been out, have you had any comment or blowback from any right-wing groups?
Surprisingly, no. Not that I'm aware of.
No question out here.
Mark, I'm not as familiar of the term seditious conspiracy as you probably got to in this film. It seems consequential from that earlier case. And I know we've had some January 6th convictions based on that. Did something change legally in the United States between that earlier failure to prove seditious conspiracy and what we have today?
Good question. I don't think anything changed in the law. There's not that much case law. I think what changed, well, as the former governor of Arkansas, who was the U.S. attorney at the time, said, the jury, if you read about that trial, one of the jurors married one of the defendants. And they asked the judge to preside at the wedding. So it was a kind of crazy scene. Yeah, that these guys got off. And as I say, at one point also in the trial, the Turner Diaries came up, and the judge asked for a copy of it, and one of the defendants then handed out a copy of the Turner Diaries to the judge and to all the jury members. So it was a very friendly jury to the defendants. And I think that's what is radically different about the trials that happened either in Washington, D.C. or Virginia with the Oath Keepers. But you're right, the term now has a lot more meaning, certainly after January 6th. And I think that was part of it too. I mean, the jury was sympathetic, these good old white boys, people they knew. But I think there was also the sense of, come on, this is ridiculous. These guys can't overthrow the government. But here's the thing I think you got to keep in mind, because I've read the Turner Diaries. It doesn't take, it's not like a civil war that we fought, back in the 1860s. A barrel of cyanide that they discovered at CSA. Can you imagine if that was in the water supply and, 500,000 people were killed? Blowing up power, this was a federal building, but let's just say 5 or 10 huge power centers, dams, power centers, nuclear, were taken down off the grid. That doesn't take thousands and thousands of people. And that's the scenario of the Turner Diaries that book is a fantasy of. That's what McVeigh saw. He saw this bombing as the beginning of the Second American Revolution, that others would do, copycat. And so even these inchoate acts that may have no relationship, although some of these mass shootings, obviously, they've left manifestos, they've left references to the Turner Diaries and to this movement, but like this most recent assassination attempt, it's hard to know where it's coming from. It's still embraced as creating the chaos, and as Dennis Mahan says, we just want to see it fall, and then we'll start something new. So there's fear, and it's a scary one, and anybody saw that film Civil War, which came out, a dramatic film, it's an insurgency. I said to Lloyd earlier, we were talking, I said, thank God Trump was not assassinated. As much as I personally, would like to see him removed from the political stage, that could have set off some of these extremist groups that already feel they're at war with the United States government. That could have set off a few things that would be very scary and frightening. So that's, I think, where seditious conspiracy comes in, is that kind of insurgency that we've seen in other countries around the world, which we never imagined could happen in the United States. I think that's where the fear is.
We're going to wrap up, but before we go, just give the audience a little heads up on, Michelle, okay, go ahead.
Go ahead and shout. I have a light voice.
Go ahead.
I can do it.
Shout it out.
Okay. So I understand for the criminal case why they might not want to implicate, look for other people. But who do you think the other person was? I mean, a lot of people, it wasn't just 2 people, right? Like you saw his picture. They can't run that through a federal database and figure out who the other person was. Like, I can't believe all this time there's been no theory, or no one even talks about it. It's not even part of it. And the second part of that is same to what you were saying before. I don't think she's crazy. I mean, I actually have a lot of trust in the government, but it doesn't look good to have the moment that he was corresponding with her. Who cut off communications? It wasn't clear. But did the government say, okay, now that we mentioned an FBI informant, we're cutting you off? Like, how did that happen?
So yes, the Bureau of Prisons, but the warden makes the decision. I'm not sure it was the same warden, but the warden of Florence, this so-called supermax prison we have, made that decision to cut that off, and that is troubling. That is definitely troubling. As far as who, look, there was a leg found that has never been identified in the ruins and body parts of the Oklahoma City bombing. They never matched it to one of the victims. And Peter Langham, or whatever her name is now, and others have said, you have to get the DNA of that leg, because that could have been the other person in the van with McVeigh. Others have said it's one of the ARA guys was there. I've heard all sorts. And there are varied descriptions, not only of that morning, but of the days leading up to the bombing where McVeigh was seen with other people. And they don't all fit the same description as John Doe 2. That's where the mystery is. That's where, obviously, you think that Terry Nichols might not know, because he wasn't there all the time, but, Andrea Strassmeyer may know. Listen, it's a good question. We've tried as hard as we could, but at one point wanted to step back and say, look, still the important message is that there's this movement that most of us, and myself included, didn't realize, kind of where it came from, that it had openly declared war on the United States, that it was legitimate to use assassination, bombings, poisonings, that was all fair game. It goes back to the early 80s, which was during the Reagan administration. It was a conservative administration, and that's where this modern patriot militia movement started. And then the Gulf War, Ruby Ridge, Waco set off this second wave that McVeigh obviously was part of. And now we're living through this third wave. We just felt that was the more important story. But those are all legitimate questions, and believe me, I am still in touch with as many people. I look forward to seeing what is reported for the 30th anniversary, but those are all very legitimate questions.
Jimmy, just let the audience know what your current project is, Hard Hats.
Hard Hat Riot, I'm doing a film now that'll be on PBS American Experience at the end of the winter or the beginning of the spring of 2025. On what was called the Hard Hat Riot on May 8th, 1970. That was the end of one of the most tumultuous weeks in American history. It was kicked off by Nixon's announcement of expanding the war in Vietnam to Cambodia. Then that Monday, Kent State happened. The 4 students were shot and killed at Kent State. Colleges, including Wesleyan, where Lord and I met up, went on strike across the country. And that Friday, there was a huge anti-war demonstration on Wall Street in New York City, and many of the construction workers working on the World Trade Center came down during lunch and attacked the anti-war protesters and beat up many anti-war protesters. And a journalist, David Kuhn, wrote a book called The Hard Hat Riot that came out in 2020. And the point of his book, which attracted our interest, was that this was an inflection point, a moment, a hinge moment where the blue-collar workers that were part of the Democratic FDR New Deal coalition were moving away from the Democratic Party and were embraced by Nixon. Pat Buchanan, Nixon put on a hard hat. There were, Nixon appointed one of the leaders of the New York Trade Union to be the Secretary of Labor. Nixon went on to win the 1972 election. He won 49 states, only Massachusetts. We're looking at that because here, again, the echoes of history, the MAGA movement, the white working class feeling their voice wasn't heard, being mobilized. This kind of seems like one of those key places to relook at, to revisit some of those voices. So that's a project that I'm working on right now.
All right, so I want to thank you for coming back to Middlebury New Filmmakers, Mark. You really are one of the most fearless filmmakers I've ever met in my experience, and you keep at it. You are keeping it going.
Well,
so we hope you'll come back again. I mean,
let me flip the script for a second.
Yeah.
Because you started something amazing here, and I know this is the 10th anniversary, and in 10 years it's kind of incredible how this festival has taken off. how, you're bringing in people now from all over the world, and films from all over the world. It's just sensational, and you and I met at Wesleyan, we made a movie together, and the fact that you have re-emerged in the world of cinema and film, no, I take my hat off, Lloyd. I know, you're moving on to the board, but I think the audience here, and certainly from my heart, I thank you for what you've done.
That's great. So, we're going to take leave of